One challenge that Peter's analysis is presenting that we find is very common amongst analysts based in the US is there's a significant overestimation of the Western technical capabilities in the oil patch and in the commodity sector in general, and a significant underestimation of the technical capabilities that China in particular and India in particular have been building in the past decade, decade and a half, while we've been de-emphasizing the sector. And I would sort of call that techno-arrogance or techno-overconfidence, I guess, because arrogance has a bit of a negative connotation that I'm not trying to imply here.
So let's listen to a clip from that, and then we'll talk on the other side.
The Russian stuff will all go away and never come back. That's cooked in now. The Russian technological base is weak. Their workforce was hollowed out before they started throwing hundreds of thousands of people at this conflict. They're incapable of maintaining their own system, especially when it comes to energy and petrochemicals and mining.
Listening to that clip uses the word all and forever and
yes,
very definitive language. And I would argue there's a few points of nuance that perhaps is lost on people who believe similar things.
A lot of the growth we have seen around the world since 1992 has been about the inclusion of places that didn't participate in the first wave of globalization into the system. That's Brazil, that's China, that's Russia. If you go back to 1992, there was only one product where Russia was a top 3 producer, and that was oil. Now they're a top 3 producer of over 20 different materials that we all use every day. Without the Russians participating eagerly, this will all go away. The question is whether it's this month, this year, this decade. So we all need to prepare for that one way or another.
So I would begin my answer by saying that we're big fans of Peter Zeihan's work, and we enjoy his daily videos, and we certainly consume them.
It's a major supplier out of the global system, basically.
Yeah, I mean, food and energy we've talked about, lumber is in there, palladium, let's say you want semiconductors, palladium and neon, integral parts of any semiconductor fab facility, it's half the global total. So there's just a lot of things we're going to have to figure out how to do differently or how to do regionally.
Again, we'd be the last to criticize somebody of Peter's stature, and he's clearly, a deep thinker on these
Sure,
matters.
you just see the probabilities different.
Yeah, well,
it's always a game of probability, right? Even when Peter says that, he's talking about this is where he thinks the probable outcome is. But how do you see it?
He is a brilliant strategist and analyst, but we do disagree with him on some points, and that's okay. And I would say one challenge that Peter's analysis is presenting that we find is very common amongst analysts based in the US is there's a significant overestimation of the Western technical capabilities in the oil patch and in the commodity sector in general, and a significant underestimation of the technical capabilities that China in particular and India in particular have been building in the past decade, decade and a half, while we've been de-emphasizing the sector. And I would sort of call that techno-arrogance or techno-overconfidence, I guess, because arrogance has a bit of a negative connotation that I'm not trying to imply here. But just to give you some numbers, in 2022, the United States produced a total of 400 petroleum engineers from, our university system. The Beijing campus of China Petroleum University alone, they have a university that has 2 campuses. It's called China University of Petroleum. You could Google it. And in 2016, they had 15,000 students in it. IIT, the IIT schools in India are amongst the most competitive schools to get into on planet Earth. The students that get in there and choose petroleum engineering or chemicals or pick your favorite heavy industry are brilliant, and they're outpacing us. I've been to universities in both countries in my time as an executive. We are radically underestimating the technical capabilities of China and India and their strong desire to get cheap energy from Russia. And so a key plank of Zeihan's thesis is that the critical commodities that Russia produces, and he correctly states that China is a major producer of many commodities, and if they were to completely evaporate from global supply chains, it would be a catastrophe of epic proportion, which is a point that we've made. There's going to be an army of talented engineers and technology workers and technologists, for example, that are going to be very seduced by the possibility of accessing cheap Russian commodities. And unless and by the way, they will build pipelines and infrastructure at a speed which would blind us because they don't have the red tape and environmental activism that we do on this side. And so we would be a little more bullish, the capability of China and India and other Russian partners to replace the technology that Russia was leaning on the West for prior to Putin's foolhardy move into Ukraine. And we would be a little more bullish on the proportion of existing Russian commodities finding their way to the market a year from now than perhaps Zeihan would be for those reasons.
Yeah, it's so interesting. It also solves the sort of brain drain that people have been talking about from Russia.
Yeah, well, again, this is all part of, I think we were speaking before we came on the air, like I'm not a China expert, and anybody who's based in the West who says they are should be looked at with some, with little dubiously, but because it is a black box. But I did travel there several times a year for the better part of a decade, and I have lots of friends there and have seen and lectured at some of these major universities. And by the way, a fun fact, before COVID, 50% of chemistry PhDs in the US were immigrants. They were on student visas at the top 25 schools in the US. And of course, all that went away with COVID. And so, that disrupted a lot of that really important brain inflow that the US relied on to produce those petroleum engineers that we talked about earlier, or your PhD chemists and chemical engineers that are so critical to the types of technologies that Zeihan describes. They stayed home. We lost that source. And having been in the sector and hired hundreds of PhDs in my career, like I can assure you that one of our differentiating offers to that market was to be very efficient at immigration. Like this was just part of our compensation package because the best and brightest minds pre-COVID wanted to be in the U.S. and with very good reasons. And so we were able to skim the very top of these undergraduate universities producing these great students, and they would all want to come to America. And not all, but disproportionately. And now that was all disrupted with COVID, and India and China are doubling down on these investments because they see the prize. The prize is access to cheap Russian commodities. Zoltan wrote a great piece on encumbrance of commodities probably about a month ago. We'd be more in the Zoltan camp than the Zeihan camp on this one for the reasons we articulated, and that only flows from our direct industrial experience. And perhaps there's some other parameter that will overwhelm that. But if you push me and in listening to that video, I would be bullish technical capabilities that are rushing into China today by the thousands to replace the brain drain that we pulled out. And I would be certainly, if we're game theorying this, from a strategy perspective, you should never underestimate your political foes. And that sounds a little bit to me like an easy underestimation of what's actually going to occur.